and welcome to today's webinar from the ReadTech Life Sciences team and our friends at Prisym ID, EU MDR's impact on labeling, UDI in Europe, and other changes. Before we begin, I'd like to let everyone know we are recording today's session and we'll email a copy of the presentation slides with the recording link within the next few days. And we'll have a live Q&A following the presentation, so please submit questions anytime throughout the event. You don't need to wait till the end. Please just be sure to use the Q&A module, not the chat module, or I may miss your message. Our presentation today will begin with a look at MDR labeling requirements compared to current regulations. Then we'll look more closely at how UDI in the EU compares to the FDA's UDI program in the US. We'll examine what changes are required to the label content, look at a sample of an old and new device label side by side, and quickly discuss cost considerations and barcoding. Then we'll finish today's presentation with a look at the device data records submitted to the EUDAMED database and how it ties to your label content. Finally, as I mentioned, we do have time reserved following the presentation to answer some of your questions, so please submit them using the Q&A module throughout the day's event. Our first presenter today is Mark Cusworth. Mark is VP of Research and Development at Prisym ID, and he has more than 15 years of experience heading up a team providing off-the-shelf and tailored solutions to life sciences companies. During this time, he's seen many significant challenges to the industry, including a significant tightening of regulations and challenges of globalization. Gary Sainer is Senior Manager of Information Solutions on our ReadTech Life Sciences team. He's a subject matter expert on UDI and other structured content submissions to regulatory agencies. And he has more than a decade of experience in the life sciences industry. And now, Mark, if you're ready, we'll turn things over to you to begin your session.
So today we're going to start by taking a look at the general label changes from Article 23.1 of new EU MDR regulations. So these rules are relevant to all the literature that's going to accompany your devices, whether it's your IFU, your sticky label, or the implant cards. These rules here are relevant to all those different pieces of information. As we look at these regulations, I'll highlight where there have been changes from the MDD, the Medical Device Directive, and also from the Active Implant Device Directive, the MDD. We've not directly included the IVD in what we're looking at today, but many of the points that we're discussing equally apply within that new regulation as well. An important point to recognise as we look at these changes is that it is highly unlikely that all the things that we're going to cover today will be relevant to you. So one of the things you need to do when you're approaching these new regulations is to actually work out first which things aren't relevant to you so you can remove them out of your problem scope. There's enough to worry about in all the other things without trying to deal with the things that you don't have to. So we start off with some nice sweeping statements and summarise these and say what they're saying is that you need to include information about you, that is the manufacturer, the product, and also any risk or safety information relating to that product. This information needs to be included on the device, the packaging, and any accompanying literature. And one of the first changes is that this now also needs to be available on your website. The bottom line of this is that more so than ever before, you need to be in control of your data. The question you have to ask is, do you have a single source of truth for this information? So we still have customers that we talk to where there are departments, inter-departments, where there isn't trust between the data that is within the company. People aren't sure whether information is correct or not. This is no longer acceptable. And so data now requires a whole company attitude, and you need to be certain that it is correct, because you will have many different systems that are going to be using this data. You may well find you're using systems like Adobe InDesign for your IFUs. You've probably got a label management system for the sticky labels. You may be potentially looking at a third system for publishing the content on your website. The more systems you have sharing or duplicating this data, the bigger the problem you will face in ensuring that this is all correct. Using systems that can pull from a single source of truth, or just by reducing the total number of systems that you're using, will reduce the complexity of this problem. The integrity of your data is going to be critical in the new generation of regulations. So what does this actually mean for our labelling? This section basically says what you are producing should look good and be fit for purpose. This might seem obvious, but as the demands of the regulations increases, which will increase the amount of information that needs to go on your labels, sometimes these simple statements can easily become overlooked. It's always worth having a fresh look at some of the guides out there that assist in ensuring that your labels meet the needs that they're intended for. Another thing not to overlook, and isn't covered as part of the regulations, but is also important, is that in addition to these things, your corporate image is also very important to your labelling. And this bears an important effect on actually how you'll design your labels and how they should look like. So where do we have to include this information? The short answer is pretty much everywhere. That anywhere that's part of your device, whether it's the packaging, the device itself, you will need to include this information. About the only exclusion from this is shipping containers. Where practical, you should be including this information on your device and its packaging. This is not new to MDD, and it pretty much aligns with the previous regulations. So somebody should be able to look at your label and read the content. This wasn't previously stated in the MDD. This is something that's new to the EU MDR, but it was always expected. And hopefully it won't be too much of a challenge to most people. Machine-readable information is a supplement to the human-readable content. You should be able to look at your device and the labels and be able to gather all the information without requiring technology to assist you. So the requirement for inclusion or IFU is not new, and again, this aligns with the previous requirements. But where we do see some changes, though, is how you include the IFUs. In recognition that a large number of IFUs are superfluous and just generate unnecessary waste, the regulations now allow you to supply a single copy of the IFU. This does require prior agreement, and you must be able to provide additional copies as required. Now, that last clause can sometimes be significant. You need to ensure that you have the ability to supply these additional IFUs, and this is often outside of your normal manufacturing process. So ensure that this is viable and that you have processes in place to allow you to do this. To go even further, though, the IFU can now be provided electronically. The IFU regulations in the EU MDR have, in a way, been refreshing, but also at the same time frustrating. New regulations are moving in the direction that has been hailed by e-labelling enthusiasts, while still showing a degree of caution. IFUs are the only labelling element now that can be completely replaced with an electronic version. This needs to be clearly marked on the product label, and there's a new EIFU symbol, including the web location, that can be used to do that. There's still concern over this regulation and the changes, and there are also a number of contradictions with other regulations that are still being clarified. And so companies are showing caution over this, which is fair enough. It may be currently seen as a high-risk area when it comes to conformity, but it is moving in the right direction. The inclusion of residual risk information is pretty much in line with the previous regulations, so there's nothing to get too excited about here. And the last item in this section that we're going to look at is the use of symbols on labels. Again, this pretty much aligns with the previous regulations. Where we have seen some changes is within the symbol regulations themselves. The new ISO 15223 has been ratified, and I would recommend that you get a copy of that. and it replaces the old EN 980, which probably most of you are familiar with. This includes most of the symbols that will be required on your medical device labels. There are some symbols that are still yet to be defined that will be required by the EU MDR, so probably there will be some further revisions to this regulation. This is not the only source of symbols, though. I've included references here to several very useful sources that can be used on your product labels. So let us move on to the subject of UDI. The UDI requirements get a whole section, a whole article to themselves within the EU MDR regulation. Article 27 talks solely about the UDI requirements. I'm sure you have, if you have already implemented UDI to meet the FDA compliance, then you'll recognise how significant a change this can be. But how does the EU MDR UDI implementation differ from that of the FDA? Are you going to have to go through that whole pain process again? Well, let's take a look. So when we're talking about UDI, what areas does this impact on? Firstly, and most relevant to us today, it affects the contents of the labels. It's required on all materials which come under the broader labelling banner, that is direct marking, primary device labels, labels on the packaging, patient cards, and the information on the manufacturer's website. UDI influences what and how the data is included on the label. And it's critical to the way in which the product data is submitted to the UDID database for the FDA or the new EUDAMED databases to the EU. So UDI is made up of two parts. We have the device identifier and the product identifier. Whenever you manufacture a device, the DI will be the same for every time you manufacture the same device. The PI will be unique to that particular device or batch of devices. So basically, the DI tells you what the device is, and the PI tells you when or which the device is. Now, the DI is a mandatory fixed portion of the UDI that uniquely identifies you, the manufacturer, the model of the device as well, and also the packaging level. Now, the DI is used to submit the information to the EUDAMED or the UDID databases. How the data is structured will differ based on the issuing agency that you are using. Most of our customers within the medical device marketplace are now using the GS1, but we still see a few that are using the HIBCC agency. For GS1, the DI will be the GTIN, and it will be stored using the AI01. Each packaging level will be assigned its own unique GTIN. For HIBCC, the DI is composed of the components that are stored in the primary barcode. That is the four-character LIC, the product number, and the packaging level, which is a single digit in that barcode, last single digit in that barcode before the checksum. All three of these pieces of data together make up the device identifier for the UDI. For HIBCC, the LIC and product number will be common across the different packaging levels of the device. Now, the product identifier, the PI, is a conditional variable portion, and that can contain several different pieces of data in it, depending on your product. It could be your lot or batch number, serial number, expiration date, or date of manufacturer. Now, the PI is not submitted into the UDID or EUDAMED databases. Now, in addition, the UDI regulations also include requirements for what content was required on the labels and how it should be formatted. Now, if we have a look at the requirements in a bit more detail, we can see where the changes are between the EU MDR and the FDA regulations. Both implementations support the use of barcodes and RFID as the AIDC carrier, the data carrier, machine readable. In the EU regulations, this must be included as barcoded UDI. This was not the case for the FDA UDI regulations, which allowed you to emit the barcode if you were using RFID. This is not likely to be too big an impact, since most of the companies that we talk to already include the barcoded UDI on the devices anyway. In most cases, EU MDR appears to be more prescriptive than the FDA UDI. Here, though, we have a couple of cases where the opposite is the case. When it comes to the format of dates in human readable content, the EU MDR allows for any standard date format. The FDA stipulates the use of the 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day format. Even if you're implementing the UDI specifically for the EU, we would still recommend using the FDI-compliant date format, as that's a more stringent requirement. The EU MDR also allows for information to be omitted at lower packaging levels if there are space restrictions. The FDA has no such allowance. So moving on to a subject which has gained a lot of attention within the EU MDR is the subject of serialization and serial numbers. As far as the requirement to identify each device with its own unique serial number, the only difference really is for active implantable devices. In the EU, these devices must be serialized. Now this can have a significant impact on your manufacturing process because you need to ensure that at all packaging levels the correct serial number and labels are applied to the correct devices. Some of our customers that we deal with have shifted the whole manufacturing across to serialized devices because it's easier to have one consistent way of manufacturing. Other companies have gone for a mixed approach, so depending on which product lines are producing which products, they've moved different lines across to serialization or kept them at a batch or lot manufacturing level. So there are different ways of approaching this, but the marketplace appears to be moving more towards serialization, so it's something that will probably be appearing more and more within regulations. So my slide has stopped moving on. There we go. Whether or not direct marking is required is very similar again, but worth confirming to your specific products. In the case of your processes, whether or not there are differences can be quite subtle. Both sets of regulations have recently provided clarifications on the wording that they use for this, and with the FDA now stating that it's for cleaned and sterilized and sanitized between multiple patients, but the EU MDR has gone for the single reusable word. Both regulations have provided further clarification on what those statements actually mean in the real world. So also, as far as direct marking is concerned within the EU MDR, it's more akin to the requirement for the rest of the product labeling. There is no option to exclude the human readable or the AIDC components. Both forms of the UDI will be required on the device within the EU regulations. So another area which actually can end up impacting not only existing companies, but actually bringing more companies into needing to comply with these UDI regulations is what class of product you're using. Previously within the FDA, the Class 1 products, the FDA only required the DI component of the EU MDR. The EU MDR now requires both of those, the DI and the PI, to be on this lower classification of product. So the impact of UDI for Class 1 product manufacturers actually now starts becoming more significant. And also, previously, where you had the Class 1 GMP exempt products, with the FDA, you could be excluded from the UDI. With the EU MDR, there is no such exclusion. So both new companies which weren't previously impacted by UDI now are going to be, and also within larger companies, there may have been divisions that previously were not impacted, but now will be. So if we now move on, we'll take a look at what this means for the label itself. Now we're going to look at a number of sections on a typical label and see where the impacts to this label are going to be. As we've just been looking at UDI, the obvious first thing to look at is how the UDI is going to impact the label. Your UDI must be in both human readable form, as can be seen at the top image that we've got there, and also as a barcode, which you can see shown on the bottom. In our experience, we're seeing many of our customers now using this change for the UDI and the EU MDR as an opportunity to switch from the old 1D barcodes to 2D barcodes. The 2D barcodes have significant benefits in not only space saving on your label, but also for customers where if you're storing additional data within that barcode, this could be for internal purposes, serialized information, actually the amount of data and the size of these barcodes actually becomes quite significant. And this can make an impact not just to the size, the space it's required on the label, but also how easy it is to scan those barcodes, how readable those barcodes are for your end user. With a large 1D GS1 barcode, the larger it is, and say the more easily it is damaged, the more difficult it can be for the end user to read. So the 2D barcodes are definitely worth considering, and we will talk about those a bit more later on. Now, the EC representative previously did not have to be on the product label. So as long as it was on one of the label, the outer packaging, or the IFU, that was sufficient. This is no longer the case. The EC representative must now be on the label. As a flip side of that, it is no longer explicitly required on the IFU, but as far as the label is concerned, this information now must be presented on the label itself. If you're using electronic IFUs, the new ISO 15223 symbol library includes a new symbol that will indicate the IFU is available electronically. This is the symbol pretty much before which indicated the use of the IFU, but you also need to include details on there which show you where you can get to that information, whether that's the website link or details or information about the manufacturer's site or something like that. It's not stipulated in the regulation, but it may also be worth considering including an AIDC link to the EIFU, particularly if your end users will be using an electronic reader as part of their typical use of the device. This can be done with a QR barcode or the likes, which are commonly used already for this type of information. Now, depending on the device you manufacture, this section here, 23.2M, could be one of the biggest changes that will impact your label. It's not only the additional space requirements that including these warnings will have, but also the translation handling that you need to go behind that to support that. The label must now include any warnings or precautions that need to be brought to the immediate attention of the user. Now, manufacturers may consider what these warnings and precautions are and whether they need to go on the label or can be just covered on the IFU. And there'll still be clarification on details on how this classification will be done. But this can be a significant impact on the label, and particularly here, we've only included 5 languages, but typically you could have many more, which uses up a significant portion of your labeling space. Now, this is probably one of the most basic, but at the same time the most significant changes within the EU MDR. This rule simply requires a new symbol to be added to every label. This means that every single one of your labels will need to be changed to meet the new EU MDR regulations. A harmonized standard for this symbol has not currently been ratified, and indication is that it will probably be similar to the existing IVD symbol, which is what we've mocked up on the screen here. And also within this section, if you're for trial devices, the exclusively for clinical investigation words, again, are required on your label and will require translation. So the requirements for devices that contain substances which are carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic to reproduction, and also endocrine disrupting substances, go further than the current requirement in the MDD. It's now necessary to include an indication of presence of things like phthalates on the unit packaging, rather than just including that information within the IFU. So again, this is having a slight increase on the amount of information that you are going to have to present to the user using the label on your product. Also for blood and tissue requirements, so that some of those are new as well, and pretty much all but the human blood derivative requirements are new within the EU MDR and require additional information to be declared on your label. Now, the reprocessing requirement is new from both directives. If a device is reprocessed single-use device, the label must include an indication that has been reprocessed, the number of reprocessing cycles that have been performed, and also any limitation on the number of reprocessing cycles. Now, this is all new information that needs to be recorded with regards to your device. This doesn't just impact your label. This will require data changes to your product data system and also your manufacturing systems for the batch information. Whether a device can be reprocessed and the maximum number of times is device data, the number of reprocessing cycles is device specific, and we need to be part of that batch serial information. Now, this can be an big impact the way your systems run within your company. And there are many companies that have chosen to no longer reprocess products because of the challenges that this new regulation requires. And again, at the moment there isn't a harmonized symbol for this, and we're still waiting to see whether a harmonized symbol will be produced or not. So we've looked at a number of cases where there's new information that needs to go onto your label, new warning symbols, new notifications that need to be given. One of the important things that we've, on a modern labeling system, is that your labels need to be driven by the data. So your labels need to be more flexible in how they can react to changes to that information. A typical example of that is what like we have here, where depending on whether it's a single use, whether it can be re-sterilized, the list of your symbols will change, and your label should be able to react to that and display that information in a space-efficient manner. And say you could potentially have 8, 9, 10 symbols required to actually be on the combination of products you have for your labels. It's no longer enough to just be able to turn a symbol on or off on your label, because the space will be too tight. You need to be able to dynamically put those symbols into a list, display them as required on the label, without them having their own fixed, defined spaces. And while we're talking about symbols, it's also worth mentioning the CE mark. This will be included on all products that conform to the requirements of the EU MDR. This is almost, at the end of the day, what you are aiming for. The only exclusions to this will be custom-made in investigational devices. Now, the CE mark is required on the label, on the device, or to the sterile packaging, and it must also be included on the IFUs for the product. And so the CE mark will normally be accompanied as well by the identification number from the body that was responsible for the conformity assessment for your products. So you'll normally have your CE mark and the number on there. So that's not really changed from the previous regulation, but it's a very important symbol that's on your label because it means that you have achieved the compliance that you need to ship that product into the EU. Now, the last slide within this section doesn't strictly relate to the EU MDR, but as we've been talking and discussing the amount of information that's going to be added onto your labels, some companies, the amount of real estate on their label is actually quite precious. And some labels are already very busy. Adding extra information actually can be quite a challenge if your devices aren't that big. One of the recent final rulings by the EU has meant that the English text no longer has to be included with the symbols. There are other conditions relating to that you may or may not want to comply with. So you may choose to include the English text because that suits you better. But it is worth considering that that option is now available as long as you redirect the person to the symbol gallery or glossary that's included within the IFU of that device. So that can be a way of gaining some precious space on your label if you need to. Now, we'll take a look now at a mock-up of a before and after label that we've done. Now, I've created a dummy label, and as you'll see on here, we have quite a lot of information. Typically, you wouldn't have all this information on a single product, and we've got a number of pieces of information there that you wouldn't expect to be on a stent. But what we've tried to demonstrate on here is showing all these different pieces of information and actually how they are changed by this new regulation and how that impacts a label as a whole. As I said before, any data that your device does not require, don't worry about it, you can ignore it. That's a bit of the regulation that you can put a line through and forget about. There's enough other things in there that you do need to concentrate on. So on the old label, you can see we've included a typical UDI GS1 128 barcode, which has been in the system, hanging around for a few years, looks good, very standard. This one we've got on here contains the GTIN lot number, expiry and manufacture date. We've also, on the old label, included the English text on the symbols. And as you can see, on the new label, even though we've reduced the space used by the UDI barcode, we've replaced that with a 2D barcode. We've taken the English text off the symbols, so the symbols now take up a much smaller space. The overall label has had a significant increase in size to actually fit all the new data on it. There's a little bit of white space at the bottom, but actually the label is becoming more busy. The most notable section in terms of space is probably the warning phrases. Here we've only included, as I said before, 5 languages on here. Typically this would be a much higher number of languages that you're going to be putting on your main labels. And that will increase the amount of space that that warning section will require. We've changed how we've grouped some of the symbols as well between these two labels. This is worth considering as it may make better use of some of that label space. Now, depending on the type of device that you manufacture, you may have further information that's required on your label. For example, catheters may require compliance charts and that sort of thing. Again, requiring extra space that will be used on this label. So the amount of space on your label is quite precious, and you can see we've got a number of new pieces of data that have been required to be included on the label that wasn't previously there. Now, I'm sure you would agree with me that the prospect of making a change to not just a few, but all of your labels is actually quite a daunting task. So we've worked with several of our customers to help them to evaluate what this impact actually is. And so a change such as the EU MDR, which within their current system requires a significant amount of time to make those changes. We've looked at how that compares when you're using modern labelling systems which have tools which would assist you in doing that sort of global change. So from working with some of our large Tier 1 customers, we're seeing varying sizes to the costs of doing this sort of global change. And as you can see on this slide, this can run into the millions of dollars. Many companies that we know are using a term which is touch once, which means they only want to make this big change to all their products the once. They don't want to have to touch all their labels a second or even a third time. Now, some of our companies that we're talking to have actually looked at this and looked at their existing systems, and maybe by 2022, they're looking at replacing their existing validated labeling systems, maybe because the platforms will no longer be supported, or it's within their normal timeframes where they would be updating their systems. One company that estimated the cost of touching each one of their labels, actually that it was going to cost in excess of $3 million to do this sort of touch once exercise. And we've heard examples actually going up to $6 million as well for our larger customers. However, they also realized that they were already planning to review and replace their current systems in the not too distant future. So they decided to take that pain now, replace their existing systems and go through that label design process that they would have to do when they replace that system. Just do it the once, which is the touch once terminology that they refer to. So the change is you're going to have to touch your labels for the EU MDR regulations. So if you're going to have that pain anyway, use that as an opportunity to replace your system with an up-to-date system that will support you for a good number of years to come and be on validated, supported platforms. So this is making the decisions very relevant now for when you're going to do these sorts of things. Several of the customers we're looking at now are looking to get systems in so they can be designing labels probably first quarter of next year, to then give them the opportunity to actually get those labels prepared into production to be able to meet the timelines required for the EU MDR regulations. So at times we may seem a long way off, but when you start looking at the amount of work and the times required for this, then actually the time frame suddenly gets a lot tighter, and you need to be making these decisions and thinking about these things now. One of the examples that we looked at, the difference between making a global change within a traditional labeling system and a modern system which has mass change tools built within it, took the time taken in man hours down from 5.5 man years to just 1 man year. So this can make a significant impact on your company. And also that the resources that are actually doing that often are very important and can be senior people within your companies. To take them out and dedicate them to an operation such as this, the rework of your whole labeling, or your labeling for your products, can be painful but manageable to do once. To try and do it a second time or ongoing, that can be very costly to you as a company. So again, looking at this, the tools available within a modern system which allow you to streamline some of these mass changes can reduce the cost going forward by sometimes up to about 90%, which means there's a lower cost of change, you have a faster time to market for your products, and also, which is very important within a regulated environment, is there's less risk due to the automation that they can bring to that process. Now, the final thing that I'm going to be talking to you about today before I hand over is the barcodes that go onto your labels. With these changes to regulations, these definitely need some consideration. We've spoken about the data that needs to go into barcode as part of the UDI, but we also need to give consideration to what the carrier of that data is. The same data can be included as machine-readable information in more than one way. It could be a traditional 1D barcode, as can be seen on the top here with a GS1128, or the barcode on the bottom where we're using a 2D barcode, which is storing an HIBC data within it. Again, that same data may also be contained within an RFID tag on the device. Each of these types of carrier can have a significant influence on the amount of space, the readability, but also the usability of that barcode throughout your entire supply chain. Now, with the introduction of UDI, it's now necessary to ensure that any barcodes printed on any of the labeling for your device meets certain quality guidelines. This is a grading from 0 to 4 or A to F, depending on the standard that you're looking at. It's no longer sufficient to check that the barcode just reads. The ability to read a barcode in a nice, clean production environment with a well-maintained scanner is a very different situation to reading the barcode on a box in a busy distribution center. For this, you require a barcode verifier rather than just a barcode reader. A barcode verifier will not only read the barcode, but also give you a grading to determine whether it meets the quality required by these regulations. We've seen this verification done at different parts of the design, approval and production process by some of our customers. Some of them verify the quality as part of the design and approval process, then ensure that their printers produce an equivalent quality by following a regular maintenance and calibration plan for each of those printers, very similar to how you would other devices on your production lines. Other customers actually include the verification as part of the startup on a production line for each batch and verify the first barcode meets the requirements and is correctly graded. So that's you doing the verification as part of the manufacturing process. Now, when you're storing multiple pieces of data on your labels, there are a number of things that must be considered. How many barcodes do you use? The more barcodes you have, the more confusing it can be to a customer or user for which one do they need to scan. If you've got a lot of data that's going to be stored within your barcode, putting it all within a single barcode can make the size of the barcode unmanageable. How small or large should that barcode be? Different issuing agencies have their own specifications on how thick the bars, the dots need to be. GS1 128 barcodes, it has recommendations on the width of the thinnest or narrow bar, as well as recommended height of that barcode. For the GS1 data matrix, they have recommendations for the size of the smallest dot. So the regulations are fairly prescriptive on what the minimum size these barcodes can be. So the more data that you put into them, you can't just reduce the size of those bars down. You have to, once you hit the limit on what the regulation allows you, your barcode is going to get larger and use up substantial space on your label. Now, where possible, you should use the smallest number of barcodes. As I said, the less barcodes on the label, the less confusion when you're trying to decide what to scan. Using 2D barcodes is becoming more of a norm. Hospitals now buy scanners that support 1D and 2D barcodes. And one of the things we have seen on some of our customers is using a mixture depending on where the label will be used. So we've seen customers which include on the primary product label a 2D barcode, but on things like the patient cards, they're still using the 1D barcode. So it is possible to use a combination of the two, depending on what data carrier is best suited to how that particular label, that particular barcode is going to be used. Now, to ensure that barcodes are of an adequate quality, there's some useful guidelines that you should bear in mind. Do not try and print the same size barcode on printers that have different dot sizes. Now, the dot size on your printer is normally given in something like a DPI, dots per inch, or DPMM, dots per millimeter. Now, printing a barcode that on a 300 DPI or 600 DPI printer isn't a problem. You just use twice as many dots for the 600 DPI printer. But if you're printing a barcode at 300 DPI and 12 dots per millimeter, this will produce a sufficient difference in the size of the barcode. If you try and print that barcode at the same size on those two different printing devices, you will get dots or bars that are printed with inconsistent sizes. And this can have a very detrimental effect on the barcode quality. Also, the material you are printing onto and the technology you're using will affect the quality. If you're using a thermal transfer printer, you may see ribbon bleed as the head heats up and cools down at the start and end of a dot or a bar. On inkjet printers, the dots may shrink or swell, depending on the surface that the ink is being applied to. To achieve a suitable quality of print, you may need to increase or decrease the bar or dot sizes based on both the printer and the label that you are using. So as a general guide, you should try to standardize on printers. If you can't standardize on printers, at least standardize on the resolutions that you're going to be printing each type of label on. If you have different resolution printers, then ensure that you include all resolutions when approving your labels and particularly testing the quality of the barcode that it meets the correct grading. Ensure that you are verifying the quality of the barcodes either within the approval or within the production process. You should make sure that you have a maintenance plan for your printers, just as you do for other equipment on your manufacturing line. Even if you are testing your quality during production, having a maintenance plan is very worthwhile on your printers, even if it's just blowing out the paper dust from your print head each day. That can have a significant impact on the ongoing quality of the labels and the barcodes that you're able to print. And the final point here is to avoid using universal label design packages which hide the impact of resolution or barcodes. Your labeling system should be able to clearly show you what your labels look like at any of the resolutions that you will be printing those labels at, and be able to adjust the barcodes so that they will print using the native dot resolution of that printer so it can get the best quality barcode that you can produce. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague now, and she wants to take control.
Thanks, Mark.
So I'll hand you over to Gary Sena.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark, for that discussion on labels. It was very timely, and it looks like a lot of activity to consider moving forward and making changes to meet the new MDR regulations for labeling. I have a short section that I'd like to put in for your consideration, and that is the actual data that needs to be part of your product registration and also your reporting. I'm going to move through the slides rather quickly. They're available for your evaluation in more detail and look at later. But one of the things that comes up in all these discussions is what is the timing for the various activities and the milestones. And as Mark had mentioned, the labeling activity has significant effort connected with it. In parallel, I would suggest that you also want to start to look at the data sets and that particular collection of data, verifying the contents and so on, that need to be part of your product registration and also of the UDI reporting to the EUDAMED, which is the European database. A couple items on this particular timeline, the ones in green are most noteworthy for the date of application for the MDR in 2020 and IVDR 2 years later. We're in the 2018 time frame now, and there is some activity going on with the notified bodies being redesignated. We're looking at a spec for the UDI data set that was originally due in February timeframe, but now delayed to October. But there is activity going on and some very good milestones being accomplished inside the EU to move forward on this particular MDR requirements. I charted some of the more granular dates as they apply to various classes of medical devices and classes of in vitro diagnostics on this particular slide. And what you'll see is that early on, actually prior to the reporting of your UDI data, there's some registration that needs to be done either by you or your notified body. And come the 2020 timeframe, May 26th, this data set would need to be reported to EUDAMED for all those particular variations of classes. Depending on the class, you'll see a 1 to 5 year time period after that 2020 milestone where the actual UDI needs to be on the label. So as Mark has said, this is quite a significant event. You do need to collect your data, submit it, and then make sure it's on the label. There is a additional 2-year period of time for putting the UDI actually on the product for your direct marking. Noteworthy is that there's some shared data that is electronically managed and submitted to the EUDAMED, and information about your economic operators and the device needs to be collected early on, and part of the registration needs to be submitted to EUDAMED. And then as part of your reporting, which is a second submission, a lot more details about the manufacturing organization and also the device attributes need to be submitted. A number of these particular data values also appear on the label. So making sure that they are in sync and obviously reflecting the same values. You have some issues with version control and changes that might occur at one location, and then making sure that the label reflects those particular changes. So there is some correlation here between the submitted data and the label content that you need to put on the package itself. In this next slide, I charted out some of the devices that need to be part of the registration. And we're just kind of looking at overall color here, so I understand unable to read this, but there's a number of fields, is the point I'm trying to make, that need to be part of the registration. Those registration fields are in the blue background, so you see some of those early on, and then they start to be shared with those in the green background, which is part of your UDI submission. And further on, in this last graphic, you see that there's a number of attributes about regulatory information, safety, production control, characteristics of the product that are only part of the UDI submission, those in green, but you also see that there's some shared content. What I want to talk about now is the two data streams that Mark alluded to earlier, and for time, won't go into too much detail here, but there is a data stream that needs to be sourced from your various internal systems and then into a UDI system, and I put RETEC in there as an example, and have that data transmitted to EUDAMED, which noteworthy is going to be made to the public. In parallel, the content that flows to the product label, and again, using Prisym as the labeling system in this example, that needs to be in sync in the event that there's common fields that are in both data streams. And being able to communicate back and forth is one of the features of our two systems. But you want to keep that in mind as you start to consider the activities and planning for meeting these regulations. One other consideration before we sign off and get into the Q&A here is taking a look at the global landscape. A lot of this discussion has its ancestry back to the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum with a 2013 guideline and then the two regulatory bodies, the FDA and EU, coming out with their regulations. And it's very apparent at this point in time that a single database is not going to occur. There might be some synchronization sharing of terms using the word convergence rather than full harmonization, but there will be regional databases as we go forward. And this is really the tip of the iceberg. When we look across the globe, EU, US, and actually Netherlands has now started all collecting information about medical devices in UDI format. There's a whole host of other regulatory bodies that are moving forward and can put specs in place momentarily. So as you take a look at your requirements for meeting FDA and now the ongoing the EU, this may be the opportunity to take a look at your system, consider a master data management and a modern labeling system to manage this information. I won't go into the details on this, but you can take a look at the full set of 10 slides that show all the fields and the various regulatory bodies that identify products. There's quite a list, and it's growing quite quickly, and I think this starts to plead for a reevaluation of your approach and a solution so that you're controlling data in a master data management system and connecting up to a labeling system. And with that, I'm going to just mention the resources. And Dan, do you want to say a few words? And then we'll get a couple questions in here yet.
Sure. I'll just mention we are coming up on the top of the hour. Our panelists have agreed to stay over a little bit, so if you can't join us for the Q&A, I apologize, but we will have a recording of this, which we'll make available. I'll just mention there are some great resources on UDI and EU MDR on the readtech.com Knowledge Center, which you'll be able to access through these slides. And as well as on Prism ID's website, they also have a white paper on EU MDR and how to implement the lessons learned from UDI in the US. If you have any questions that aren't answered through today's presentation, please feel free to contact one or both of our teams following the presentation. We'll be happy to speak with you. So now we'll go on for a few moments to some of the questions we received. So this first question I'll ask to you, Mark. Says, will there be limited space exemptions for direct marking with EU MDR? Could a product have human readable but no barcode if a barcode can't fit?
Covered back in one of the points earlier about the comparison of direct marking. So there is some exceptions for direct marking with it being technologically not feasible. So that is an exception that you could consider. The other exception is for a situation where applying that direct mark would cause a decrease in the safety and the effectiveness of the product. So those are two that you could evaluate and claim. I'm not aware of one that would be for a limited space option for direct marking.
Looks like Mark's telephone icon has come back, so hopefully we have him back. If not, Gary, I'll keep tossing these questions to you. The next question, are IFU provided with every shipment, or can one IFU be provided to a location irrespective of the number of shipments?
Yeah, there is provision for using a single IFU for a bulk, and that's something that is now a possibility. So making that available to, let's say, your distributor in a single form, and then as necessary, they would make that content available as it distributed out to the public.
Okay. And Mark, have you been able to rejoin the audio? Mark, Mark is having problems unmuting, so Gary, I'll keep sending questions your way. If our device isn't to be reprocessed at all, it's single use only, we currently use the 2 with the circle and line through it, I guess as a symbol for single use.
Yep,
will we need additional indicators?
No, I believe the single use symbol would only be applicable in your scenario. A 2 with the line through it crossed out, indicating not using it second time. There is this second variation of that symbol that is for reprocessing devices, but if you're not using that particular or intending your product to be used in that particular fashion, then you don't need to use that multiple reprocessing symbol.
Okay. There's a question here about what about NHS requirements for the UK? Are they consistent with EU MDR?
Yes, so there is some timelines in place. There actually, some of those milestones have already transpired for your Class 3 products and Class 2A and 2B later this year. So there's some activities that you should be aware of if you're selling product to the National Health Service of England. So if you have you or a distributor are selling product to a trust inside that system, you need to comply with some of the requirements. The requirements are in sync with the MDR, so they are making good effort to stay in sync. I was aware of one place where there was an exception, and they quickly revised their requirements to match up with MDR. So there's a lot of details in MDR that still need to come out in some of the implementing acts and so on. But we do expect National Health Service to be in line with those.
Okay, I have another question here. Does the text in the symbol gallery have to be translated to other languages than English?
That's not my area of expertise, but I believe it does. So if you have information in your IFU that defines the actual symbol in the glossary, then just as you're putting the IFU in various languages, then I would also believe that the glossary would need to be translated.
Okay. Must the quantity be included on an MDR compliant label?
I believe quantity is one of those fields that needs to be there. It's currently one of the fields that I'm aware of is, Ricardo, on the FDA's labels. So quantity of the package is, to my best opinion, or my understanding is that it would need to be included.
Okay, and I've seen a couple of questions on this topic having to do with different levels of labeling, primary and secondary. Are there considerations with respect to what must appear at different levels of labeling?
Yeah, that's a good question. You can do some additional research in the GS1 general spec. There is requirements for the different packaging levels to have a unique device identifier. And let's say some of the information of the production identifiers flows to those higher levels, but in the event, for example, you might have a higher container that has a couple different expiration dates assembled together. So then the question is which expiration date you use. So the guideline has been to use the most current, or the one that would be enforced earliest. So as you start to look at some of those production identifiers, that's probably where it comes into play. Again, serialization can be an issue where you have serialization of the individual devices, and then you have a pack of 10. Obviously, there's 10 different serial numbers, represented in that pack, and then applying serialization to the higher levels. So I refer further questions to Mark and the GS1 general spec.
Okay. And it looks like Mark also, he is messaging me, although he's still having trouble getting unmuted. He wanted to clarify on the previous question about the languages. Glossary text probably only needs to be in English, as it's an FDA requirement to save, to have English on the symbols. I think since we don't have Mark and we're several minutes over the top of the hour, we're going to wrap up there. But again, thank you everyone for joining us, and please do feel free to contact us, send us emails with questions that we weren't able to get to. We'll be happy to help you as best we can, and we hope that we will see you at our next event. Thanks.